Welcome to the show where we expose new perspectives on our ever-evolving world through the lenses of various industries, cultures, and backgrounds. Our guests are disruptors, united by a common goal to bring their purpose to life. Whether they're from the commercial world or third sector, from the global north or the global south, expect an inspirational journey that will transform your perspective on just what is possible. My name is Philippa White, and welcome to TIE Unearthed. What if the tools that got you to the top of your field are the very things now holding you back? Not because they were wrong, but because what's being asked of you now is something different entirely. Welcome to episode 118 of TIE Unearthed. My guest today spent the early decades of his career learning to think in systems, first as an engineer, then through philosophy, then urban planning. Each step deliberate, and each one adding a layer that the previous couldn't quite reach alone. Philippe Vandenbroeck is a strategist, researcher, writer, and photographer based in Belgium. He is the founder of shiftN, a consulting network with 30 years of experience helping organizations navigate complex strategic questions. He lectures at ETH Zürich, where he teaches imagination as a pre-design practice. And he is a doctoral researcher whose work sits at the edges of architecture, transformation, and what he calls silent urban change. But he arrived at this conversation, well, at least in part, through a walk, through a small alpine village called Tenne, through a poem, through 40 years of reading Frederick Hölderlin, a romantic poet whose work found him when he was young and never quite let him go. What Philip found in Tenne, or what found him there, is at the heart of what we explore together. And it raises a question that feels increasingly urgent for anyone in a position of leadership right now. What if the organizations we're leading are asking us the wrong questions? Not because the questions are unimportant, but because the question we are able to ask, the one the system permits, is not yet the question that matters. We also talk about the Romantic period's response to the Industrial Revolution and why he thinks we may be living through something similar right now. About why imagination is not a luxury but a precondition for genuine change. And about his suggestion that perhaps resilience is no longer the most honest guide. Perhaps it's joy, curiosity, and love that might serve us better. So if you've ever sensed that the questions you're being asked to answer are somehow smaller than the moment you're actually in, and if you've sensed that something in the way we're leading just needs to shift, but you're not quite sure toward what, this one's for you. Philip, welcome to TIE Unearthed. Hello, Philip. It's so wonderful to have you with us today. How are you?
Hi, Philippa. I'm well. Thank you. Calling in from Belgium.
Yes, I was going to ask.
Countryside, rolling hills. So really happy to be here and to be, invited as your guest.
Thank you. Yeah, I can picture it. It sounds absolutely gorgeous. Is it a sunny day?
It's a variable day, it's blustery and we have had some serious rain showers here, but now blue sky and...
Oh, nice. Yeah, well, interestingly, we're entering into the rainy season where I live on the northeast coast of Brazil, just below the equator. And This morning I went to the gym, and as I was driving, I sort of looked, and when you have those clouds that they're almost blue, they're just so angry. And I was stretching, and I suddenly heard this extraordinary sound, and I looked out the window, and it was just torrential rain. And when I came back home, it was so much rain in such a short amount of time, everything was flooded. It was extraordinary. So we also have, but it's nice now. So also variable. Philip, I would love to start in Tenne, this story. I read your piece that you sent me, and I'm so happy that you sent that to me because it was just so rich with so many layers of so many things that we can talk about that I'm so interested in, and I'm just really looking forward to this conversation. You weren't there for work or research. From what I understand, you arrived curious and looking for beauty and poetry, and it was a walk inspired by Hölderlin. What did that experience reveal to you about that relationship between imagination and place and how we care for one another?
Well, for those not in the know, and I suppose, most of the listeners won't have an idea of where Tenna exactly is, but it's a very small village in the Swiss Alps. So if you look at the map and you kind of squint at the Swiss map, it looks like kind of a diamond shape. Then you put your finger in the center and then you move to the right, to the east. Then you get more or less, you get into Tenna. So it's a very small village and it's positioned high above the Rhine Valley. It's actually quite
Oh,
close to
wow.
where the Rhine, the kind of
Yeah.
majestic river Rhine, finds its source. So that's quite special. And in a way, it's also related to the kind of story that's behind my presence there. Because indeed, as you say, I was retracing the steps, hypothetical steps to be sure, because we are not quite sure whether that poet, Friedrich Hölderlin, German poet, lived late in the 18th century, early in the 19th century, whether he's ever really been there. There is a hypothesis that he might have been there. And there's a really interesting story behind that, but I won't go into that. Basically, my presence in Tenna was a result of being in love. And what do you do when you're in love? It's not something you really think about. You try to go after the source of your inspiration or adoration. And in this particular case, I've been, let's say, adoring Hölderlin and his work for about 40 years.
Wow.
It was in 1988. I know I wrote it into the book that I received from my then girlfriend, a kind of
Wow.
an anthology of Hölderlin poetry, and I was hooked, and I'm still hooked. So one of the things that I like to do is to give those kinds of historical presences texture and body by following in their steps. And so to travel in search of what inspired their poetry. And landscape is important in Hölderlin's work.
Mm-hmm.
There's one poem in particularly, and it's called The Rhine. It was
Oh,
written
interesting.
in 1801. It's very early in the 19th century. And that's the poem that inspired me in a way to go to that particular place. And I will read you the first lines.
Please.
I was sitting in the dark ivy at the gate of the forest, just as the spring was visited with the gold of noon, pouring down the steps of the Alps, which I call the fortress of the gods, in the ancient sense, architected by the heavens, and from which many decrees are still mysteriously handed down to men. There, against all expectations, I grew aware of a fate, even as my soul, lost in its own conversation in the warm shade, had already wandered off to Italy and beyond to the shores of Maria. And Maria is an old name for Greece. Greece was, in that particular period, a kind of an idealized vision of what a society could be. And so there you have Hölderlin dreaming about Greece and then suddenly becoming aware of a fate. And that fate is the fate of the young Rhine, which is actually kind of thundering in the canyon below his feet. That's why I went to that particular place. And Tenna was not my destination at that point in time. My destination was a very small village. It's a hamlet. It's called Scardanal. And it's actually on the shoulder of the valley opposite of Tenna. So when I walked up to Scardanal and then beyond, traversing the whole ridge towards the north to the big peak Beverin, I became aware of this really marvelous jewel-like little village, which you could see from the ridge, peering down into the valley. You could see it on the shoulder. And I thought, wow, this is so beautiful. I really want to go there. And so that image, jewel-like, of Tenna kind of floated around in my mind for these years until a couple of months ago. I had a free weekend in between my teaching duties at the university in Zurich. And so I had a kind of a 2-day window. And I thought, now's the time to go to Tenna. That's how I ended up in Tenna. And so this is
Wow.
about, in a way, love. It's about an infatuation. It's about, following that hunch. It's about cultivating also that beauty, that beautiful image that kind of continued to float around in my mind and to animate me. Yes, that's why I was there.
It's so beautiful, just picturing all of it. In your writing, this idea that some of the most humane and imaginative projects often struggle the hardest within these existing systems. And I just wonder if you could bring to life, why do you think our institutions so often resist the very innovations that could make us more human?
Yeah, from my point of view, in my experience, I would say the reality in our organizations and institutions is very often not so poetic. I think we have to face the reality that, organizations haven't fundamentally changed beyond where they were, let's say, 250 years ago. So they're still fundamentally kind of Taylorian oriented, scarcity driven or scarcity based, basically still fixed in what I would call a managerial kind of fix almost. And it has advantages, makes certain things possible and other things, less likely and less possible. I think it's a stark reality in organizations that are driven by an economic purpose, but I think it's even true beyond that, in society at large. Even yesterday, I read a really interesting number in a report that was published by Demos in London on the state of our democracy and what we can do to repair democracy. And the number was 1.5% of all our time is devoted to political civic action, meaning 89.5% is devoted to keeping the status quo or incrementally bettering that status quo. But the conversations that happen about the conditions within which that status quo inches towards that improvement, that's in the 1.5%. And so these are the conversations I think that, we need to have conversations about values, about the moral dilemmas that are embedded in change with the winners and the losers. And it's just that organizational kind of reality that we created for ourselves is a reality that keeps these kinds of conversations from happening. And that's unfortunate, and it's all to change, I think.
When we spoke a little while ago, I found your background and the various different areas that you've worked in absolutely fascinating. And my next question is around sort of the decades that you've spent working in systems thinking and organizational transformation. Before I get to my specific question, I just wonder for our listeners, because it's so varied, but it's so important, I think, right now to have the mix that you've had to help us reflect on where we're at right now. So you've been on a bit of a journey and you wouldn't imagine going down that route, but actually it's so important, I think, which also has so much to do with the reason why you were in TENA. But can you just bring to life your background?
Sure. There's a couple of things maybe worth sharing about that. One is that I'm originally from a worker kind of background, worker family, and I was the first in my family to obtain an academic degree. And so in a way, I grew out of that kind of environment. And still, of course, I'm kind of wedded to it. So that in-between position between being from that setting and environment and then having been growing out of it is something that I think has been quite decisive in the way that I am in the world, so to speak. In terms of, let's say, training, I did indeed collect a kind of an idiosyncratic mix of degrees, so to speak. I started out as an engineer, as an agronomist, actually. Then soon after, and actually in parallel with my engineering studies, I started to study philosophy because I've always been attracted by both humanities, art, and more scientific and technical subjects. So at that point, it was really difficult for me to make that choice. And I followed my inclination to engage in kind of more philosophical reflection. So I obtained my master's in philosophy, and then later on, I did a degree in kind of urban planning, urban design, which does not make me a designer, but it opened a window to me to another way of dealing with complexity. And so in hindsight, this was an interesting mix. It equipped me quite well to do the kind of work that I've been doing, mixed both conceptual thinking, solution-oriented thinking, and then the designerly approach. That's an interesting kind of field in terms of competencies and skills and types of knowledge to be basing the kind of practice on that I've been developing over the last, say, 3 decades as a consultant in the office that I founded 30 years ago, shiftN. And then beyond that, I've been picking up academic work again. About 4 years ago, I started a PhD, which I'm now in the final stage. It's in urbanism, affiliated with the Swiss Polytechnic in Zurich. And that research is very much in the TENA spirit, I would say. But, the power of places in a way to bring new things to life. Yeah, apart from that, I mean, maybe worth mentioning as well, I've always continued to, be interested in art, and I also developed an artistic practice. It's particularly rooted in photography and in writing, and I'm increasingly meshing these different kind of media and ways of expression. And I think I'm at a point now in my life where the academic, the professional, the personal, the artistic is all flowing into one another to form something which, I don't know either how to describe.
To be determined. But that's the beauty of all of this, right? That brings us to my next question, really, because increasingly, as you've just said, your work does seem to be moving beyond just systems when you think of where you were, and now much more towards imagination and images. And as we've just said, even the unnameable, right? It is to be determined. And I'm just curious, looking at that journey, what shifted for you?
I'm entertaining this idea of a developmental ladder, so to speak, that moves from systems thinking to what I call systems tinkering to systems being. And it's basically a kind of a journey from mastering certain tools that help us to clean up messes to, and that's the tinkering then, staying with the messes or staying in the mess, and that's the being then, to accepting our own mess or accepting our own role in other people's messes. I think that's basically what I mean with this development trajectory from thinking to tinkering to being. The way I'm presenting it as a ladder, as a journey through stages, is, I think, a valid way to look at that. Although some people may enter into this kind of developmental cycle in a very different way. They may have certain gifts which allows them to enter at the being stage, so to speak. So that's a caveat. I don't want to present it as a kind of a fixed framework, but it fits in a way my own developmental trajectory and dynamic. I got acquainted and exposed to system thinking ideas a long time ago, and then through practicing it professionally, using it, working a lot with important mentors, I grew into a way of practicing it that is really about staying with the trouble, so to speak, as Donna Haraway, for instance, talks and writes about it. I think most of my energy is now going into this transition from tinkering to being. And again, I'm not claiming any sort of mastery here. This is a trajectory that's full of pitfalls, requires a lot of humility. There is a shift, that involved. And I think it's an ontological shift, to use that kind of philosophical term. I think when we move from the tinkering to the being, we enter into some kind of a different world. That's what I mean by ontological shift. And curiously, we started with Hölderlin as a romantic poet. The Romanticism was an important kind of juncture in time. Why? Because you have to picture that late 18th century. The Industrial Revolution was, in a way, quietly coming to, gaining momentum. The world was changing before people's eyes. Enlightenment projects started to become visible and embodied in the kind of environment people lived. That's where the romantic reaction came. They wanted to, in a way, re-sanctify almost the world. So what they did was they connected to a much older way of looking at the world. This is what I call an expressive ontology. It's not about us being in the world as separate subjects, looking at the world, standing in front of it and saying, we're going to intervene, control, master it. But it's much more about how we become part of an unfolding process. And that's a very old idea. This goes back to, late antiquity, Neoplatonists, and so on. But there's an unbroken line of intellectual kind of development that's mostly been in the shadow of the Platonic Christian orthodoxy, later, of course, scientific orthodoxy. But the Romantic poets picked it up again. And I think today we are reconnecting back to those ideas.
Totally. And it's so interesting because, the Industrial Revolution was obviously, as you say, before people's eyes, just the world was just changing. We're in a similar moment right now, right?
Right, exactly. Yes.
And so we're in a very similar moment right now. And no one knows where things go, but I think you and I probably have a similar opinion about where, and it's so fascinating how you say during that time people went back to what fueled humanity.
That's right.
And there's similar murmuring and sort of ripples happening now. And you just think, God, it's an interesting moment that I don't believe it's going in the same way that Sam Altman is thinking it will. And Elon Musk. I really don't.
No.
Just listening to what you're talking about, the human being has a very visceral response to all of this. And it's fascinating that we have been there before. Let's talk about the being. You wrote something really beautiful about sort of creating the path by walking it, right? So again, this is embodying change or the future that you want by making it part of you. And in a world where leaders are constantly being asked for certainty, how do we learn to move forward when the way only emerges through action itself?
Well, what you're articulating there, Philippa, is exactly that ontological shift.
Yeah.
That's the shift from standing in front of a system, wanting to intervene in it, versus being part of it and being a partner or a co-creator in its unfolding. That's a fundamental difference. That's what we call philosophically an ontological difference. So the question you're asking is, how do we make that transition? Which is not an easy question or an
exactly, because I feel like this is where because I'm also trying in all of this craziness that's happening, and also on a personal level, I've been through so much, and I just resilience is something that really fascinates me, and different people's response to the current moment in someone's life that is moving. Now, when we're talking about resilience, I'm not talking about companies putting a whole lot of pressure on people and telling people to be resilient. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the world shifting, the ground moving from beneath our feet. There's so much uncertainty. What is the next 5 years going to hold? And it's, as a leader, how does one embrace this?
My proposal is to shift the discourse from resilience, which to my ears sounds rather kind of stiff upper lip, to joy, curiosity, and love. We're back to Hölderlin, we're back to the jewel-like image of Tenna. That's what needs to animate us. And something that really, or a set of ideas that really kind of resonated with me. And I think it may resonate with a lot of people that, may find this talk about kind of joy and love and maybe too fluffy, is the work of management scholar Saras Sarasvati. She did absolutely extraordinary work on what she called effectual entrepreneurship. Saras was, did her PhD with Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon, one of the kind of luminaries in the systems discipline, Nobel Prize winner economics, one of the fathers of AI, and so on and so on. So Saras did amazing work on trying to understand how, say, entrepreneurs create something from nothing. He found out was, this has nothing to do with business plans. And she came to some sort of model. It's a set of things you do, hence activities. It's a coherent set of things you do that bring to life new things. What are these things? It's very simple and I think recognizable for everyone. First, you start with what you have. So one bird in the hand, more important than 10 in the sky. Start with what you have. When you get to cooking in the evening, preparing dinner, you open the cupboard, you see what's there, you start. That's
Yes.
the spirit. That's one. The second is you have some kind of idea of what animates you. What triggers your desire and curiosity. Try to get that more or less clear, more or less. Then there's a really important thing, which is about assess affordable risk. It's not about the managerial logic of this is where we want to go and these are the resources we're going to invest to get there. No, it is about, if I'm going to take the next step in this uncertain context, what am I prepared to lose? That's the question. And if you take those three, this is what I have, resources, this is what I'm prepared to lose, and this is what I'm animated by, what I desire, you start to move out into the world and you start to build connections and interactions. And from those connections, other commitments flow or grow. And those commitments, they're going to, on the one hand, give you access to more resources, but they're also changing your understanding of what it means, what you're actually really wanting. And that's a learning cycle. All kinds of new things emerge, whether it's a product or whatever, or a company or a piece of art, it doesn't really matter. And it's so simple, but it's not driven by certainty. It's not driven by the desire to create a very specific thing. It is driven by what you really long for.
Yeah. Isn't that extraordinary? And it's so interesting because there's some professions, for example, are very analytical. And so, as people, that uncertainty is very difficult to sit with. If you think of the professions, I mean, engineers, actually, engineers or analysts or, researchers or whatever, they need that certainty. And so, sitting with that uncertainty and being able to sit with that discomfort is so hard. And their response would be to shut things down by, okay, no, we need to find the answers. No, we need to, because inside it's a very uncomfortable feeling. But
Yeah.
it's so important to know that about yourself, actually, and then to be able to say, okay, I know that this is really uncomfortable, but actually, in order to get past this, we need to sit with it. We need to be curious. We need to ask the questions. We need to be vulnerable. We need to say that you don't know, and that's okay. But it's really interesting from a psychological point of view. Some people, it's easy. So, some people, the entrepreneurs, for them, this is something that fills their cup. I'm an entrepreneur. So for me, taking risk isn't that it's calculated risk, but, it really motivates me. And I get quite excited. And when there's sort of uncertainty, I sort of, oh, this is quite fun. Let's see where this goes. And it's quite exciting. But there are some professions and there's some types of people where that is really not comfortable. And it's fascinating, right? Because it's something that self-awareness as well, I think, is just so important because everything that you've said, leaders actually really need that self-awareness piece. They really need to understand themselves so that they know how best to move through this moment, actually. It's so interesting.
I agreed. I mean, we can't kind of short circuit that kind of psychological and temperamental factors. The shift is really from thinking in terms of what hanging on to certainty, avoiding, so to speak, vulnerability, to embracing that uncertainty and desiring to be vulnerable because you're animated by something, that draws you further
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
forwards.
Yeah. And you actually, if you think about it, you can't actually have that curiosity and that creativity unless you are willing to sit with that uncertainty and to embrace that vulnerability. Because at the end of the day, to be curious, you need to be vulnerable enough to say, what is that? I've never seen that before. It's that certainty, that not having any doubt that I know everything, it shuts everything down. And then you try sort of really hard to kind of control things, which obviously isn't possible to do in many cases.
One interesting twist, maybe, is the following. When you reason in terms of risks and costs, that threatens to paralyze you. But an interesting question, and it's about halfway house for me, from making the jump to to the joy and the risk you want to embrace. But halfway house is to ask the question or reframe the question from what's the cost to what's the opportunity cost of not doing something. That's an interesting question.
That is, yeah,
Because,
yeah.
it's going to cost us, to innovate. Yes. But if you don't innovate, what will be or can be, the ultimate costs? That's the opportunity cost. And that's a really interesting question. And I think it's from a kind of a managerial and even from, let's say, a governance point of view, a board ought to ask that kind of question all the time.
So good. We spoke about Jung and synchronicity and the idea that symptoms can be expressions of something deeper trying to emerge. How has that changed the way you understand organizations or even society itself?
Yeah, the idea of a surface and depth is a persuasive idea, and I remain wedded to that. I mean, it has strong analytic potential. I mean, there's a fixture in the systems thinking kind of toolbox, which is called the systems iceberg, where you have, it's a metaphor for demonstrating or alerting us to the fact that what we see happening around us in the outside world is symptomatic for forces and developments which are, so to speak, under the waterline, so more structural, invisible, and they help to explain what we see, when we open the paper or when we follow the news feed, they help us to explain. So it's a question of why. And when we ask that question, we get to progressively deeper layers of explanation, so to speak. It's a persuasive way of reasoning. And I mean, Jung was an amazing systems thinker. What I discovered a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine came back for one day, spent a weekend in London, and just offhandedly mentioned that he visited the bookshop and bought a book by Jung. And I thought, Jung? I studied philosophy, but I never read anything about Jung. I thought he was a crackpot or something. But that it was a small signal, and I decided to hang on to it. So I became not interested in Jung, but I thought I have to pay attention to that. And so one day I drove down with my kids at the time, to Switzerland. We were going on summer holiday, and I had an audiobook, an introduction to Jung's thinking. Can you imagine?
Which your children loved listening to on the way. Yeah, they would have loved that. Yeah.
We had to. I was totally fascinated by what I heard, and then I read his, so to speak, autobiography. An amazing book which immediately confirmed to me the stature of Jung as a major systems thinker. And there is such a beautiful passage at the very end of the book, and he says, "I'm astonished, I'm disappointed, I'm pleased with myself, I'm distressed, I'm depressed, rapturous. I'm all these things at once and cannot add up the sum. I am incapable of determining ultimate worth or worthlessness. I have no judgment about myself and my life. There is nothing I am quite sure about. The more uncertain I have felt about myself, the more there has grown up in me a feeling of kinship with all things."
Yeah.
This is goose pimple stuff. Whoa.
But I mean, that's so amazing, because that is Jung as well, right? Because it's all about the yin and the yang. You need to go through the difficult moments and you grow, but then it's that push and pull, right? I mean, that's so much of what he talks about.
Yes.
And it's such a beautiful explanation, actually, of life is that. And it's being okay with that.
It's the pinnacle of systems being, from my point of view. It's the point where you're unable to articulate worth or worthlessness. I can sense how that is the apex. It's not that I'm there, but it struck me as so unbelievably wise. That's where all the categories that we've built up about and for ourselves,
Right.
They just disappear, they dissolve.
And actually, even with how we are right now, with everything that's going on, is it worthless or is there worth it? Where is everything going?
Yeah. So what I wanted to express is, yes, that idea of depth is a persuasive one, but I'm also wedded to the opposite in a way, to the idea that, there is only surface. There is only images of jewel-like villages in the Alps, or, it could also be a shantytown, for that matter, whatever, in a way exerts a fascination on us and invites us then in an effectual-like process of discovery. And then where's the depth? I wouldn't know. I think that's also very Jungian.
There's a line in your writing that stayed with me. Some people sense that the question they are allowed to ask is not yet the question that matters. And I just wonder, what are the questions that you think organizations and perhaps society more broadly are still afraid to ask?
Well, what I'm sharing there is an observation. It's the observation that those questions aren't being asked. And it goes back to the 1.5% that I mentioned earlier. Honestly, I'm not in a position to say what those questions are or ought to be. That ought to be the kind of focus of our conversation, and then to see what emerges from that. What I try to do in my work is tinkering with ways to create a space for these questions, to find a legitimate expression in a way. And that's what my systems practice is about. You could phrase it in more technical terms, in terms of the viable systems model. For instance, Stafford Beer, he says, and again, it's one of those kind of beautiful, almost Swiss pocket knives, intellectual Swiss pocket knives. He says, any system that is viable, that is able to maintain its integrity and existence in a changing environment, needs to have a certain minimal set of functions. It's actually quite similar with what Saras is saying in a very different register. And one of those functions is what he called the identity function. The identity function is the place where we are able to ask those questions. It's the place where we really interface with the world around us. The identity function is not only populated with people from within the organization, but also from outside of the organization. So typically a board, for instance, but it can also be other organizational forms or embodiments. So a lot of my work is to convince clients that they need this kind of function and to help them to create the infrastructure, to host it, and to expand the language they are using to be able to ask those questions. That's the contribution. I'm not asking the questions. I'm merely incentivizing them and sensitizing them to building the infrastructure to do so. That's basically what my work is about.
And a lot of your work also seems connected to the idea of works of peace rather than domination, extraction, or control. So what do you think it means to lead or even live in a more life-giving way today?
Well, the expression "works of peace" is one I borrowed in the piece that I wrote on Medium and published on Medium from Otmar. Otmar was somebody I met at this little village, Tenna. He's an amazing guy. But what he's doing now is in his late 60s. He's running an elderly home, to put it simply. It's just beautiful social innovation project. And he calls it Friedensarbeit. That's the German word for works of peace. I think it's really beautiful. From my point of view, what is really constitutive, essential for works of peace is trust. And that is something we have to acknowledge. The trust is always fragile. That's inescapable. So if you want to hedge against opportunism and breach of trust, you already have crossed into the other side. We can't do that. We can't guard ourselves to being bruised in the experience of working in trust. So that's the kind of fundamental vulnerability I think that accompanies. And that's interpersonal in our relationships with other people. But I think it's also, and I mean, it's not only I who think that, there's a Italian philosopher, Federico Campagna. He wrote a book about 3-4 years ago. It's called Technique and Magic. And there he argues that the vulnerability is ontological, is foundational for the way things work, belongs to the order of things. And why that is, that's really an interesting question. That is something that keeps me busy, and I want to spend some more time on, try to understanding that.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. We have actually come to the end of our podcast. But before we do finish, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you feel is important to say right now?
Maybe just a motto or something that struck me at some point about 2 years ago or something. And I would express it as follows. We're not in control. We are not thinking the ideas. The ideas are thinking themselves through us. That is an experience which I've been sensitive to.
That's really beautiful. So interesting. And this is what I was going to say when we were talking about the synchronicity part of Jung, just as we're finishing. As you were talking about Tenna and as you were bringing to life the jewel-like imagery, and I live in Olinda, and there's all these churches all over the place. And I often have podcasts at this time, and usually the bells chime at certain times, but they chimed for so much longer today, and they chimed at different times, which is there must be something happening at the church, but it's so crazy because I don't think you could hear them because Zoom shuts this down, but for about 20 minutes, the church bells were ringing at that time that you were talking. And I know that that's just so crazy, but it's just that for me, just brought to life as you're bringing to life this jewel-like imagery, and then suddenly this sort of outside force started coming in with these church bells. Anyway, on that note, just to say it is so incredible to chat with you. Thank you for this energy. I feel like I've just been injected with something to keep me going for the rest of the day. So thank you for that. Absolutely fascinating, really beautiful. Yeah, I hope we can do this again sometime soon.
to join you and engage in conversation with you, and hope to continue.
Me too. Until next time.
All right.
Hey everyone, it's Philippa again. I hope you enjoyed listening. Now, if you'd like to dive a little deeper, why don't you check out my book, Return on Humanity, Leadership Lessons from All Corners of the World. It reveals how putting people first is actually the smartest, most competitive business strategy of our time. And if you're ready to break through disengagement, spark innovation, and build agile, purpose-driven teams, let's talk. Whether it's workshops, offsites, keynotes, or full-scale leadership programs, we'll shift paradigms and create the change you're looking for. Visit philippajwhite.com to learn more or get in touch. A huge thanks to Berna Vieira for the music and to Pete Morgan for his help with the editing. Until next time, and I hope we'll meet again soon.